All right. Well, thank you all for being here this afternoon for organizational suggestions for mitigating vicarious trauma, sponsored by Women's Advocates, and featuring Meg Kelly. I would love to let you to know what brings you into this webinar. What are you seeking to learn as we talk today? Um, While we're doing that, I am going to kick us off with a land acknowledgement. Women's Advocates work takes place on Dakota land. The area that's now St. Paul, Minnesota, was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. But through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. This webinar has 3 parts. I am officially going to turn it over to Meg for her expertise and input. In the meantime, if you do have questions, comments, concerns, put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. I'll keep Meg aware as your questions and comments come up so she can answer them or comment on them. But without further ado, Meg Kelly, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. And I just want to make sure I'm seeing the welcome slide. Do I have control over the presentation? I think it may be somebody else.
Ooh. You don't, but if you're just seeing the welcome slide, that might mean that everybody else is just seeing the welcome slide.
Yes.
All right, please hold.
Yeah. Anyways, while that is getting set up, there we go. Perfect.
Okay, great.
Perfect. So I just want to quick go over the 3 different parts of this webinar and thank everybody for being here. I'm super excited to give this presentation today. In part 1, we're going to be talking about understanding vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. Part 2, we're going to be talking about creating compassionate policies and fostering supportive culture within the workplace. And then part 3, we're going to be talking about promoting sustainable self-care for workers. Reminder to just add your questions to the Q&A, and the slides and certificates will be available after the event. Okay, so topics for engagement. We're going to provide a space for you to build awareness about vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. Help you to further understand ways to begin creating and implementing compassionate policies and fostering that supportive workplace culture. There's also going to be some tangible ideas for promoting sustainable self-care for the workers within your organization. A little bit about myself. My name is Meg. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Indiana. I also host a podcast about burnout for mental health providers, and I am an advocate for helpers. So I really have a lot of passion in helping those who help others. My specialties in my clinical practice are treating helpers and healers who are struggling with burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. You can find me on Instagram at the Anti-Work Therapist, and my podcast is called Mental Status Podcast. Okay, so let's dive in. We're going to talk first about understanding vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to look at vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue as being incredibly similar. There are some different organizations that have different definitions of the two, but for this webinar, we're going to be going off of the definition that both of them are very similar to one another. And vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue are essentially the emotional residue of the exposure that providers have from working with people as they're hearing about their trauma stories and becoming witness to the pain, fear, and terror that the trauma survivors have endured. So the way that this might impact the providers within your organization are things like increased and persistent anger, rage, sadness, hopelessness, things that we would kind of qualify as those negative emotional states. They may become more hypervigilant and have an increased startle response. They might become more overly involved, either emotionally or mentally, with the survivors that they're working with. They may start to experience a lot of bystander guilt, shame, feelings of self-doubt, wondering if they could have done anything differently. They might have preoccupation with or intrusive thoughts about the survivors that they work with outside of the work situation. They may also experience horror and or rescue fantasies. They may begin distancing themselves, numbing. They may become detached. They might start to cut off the survivors that they're working with, or they may use staying very, very busy as a form of distancing and numbing themselves. During the workday and even outside of work, they may start to avoid situations where they would be listening to survivors' stories or hearing about traumatic experiences. And they may end up experiencing some difficulty in maintaining professional boundaries with the people that they're working with and even with colleagues. This might look like overextending themselves, having fuzzy boundaries, trying to do more in the role than is what is necessary for them. So go to the next slide. I want to kind of emphasize the fact that burnout is different from vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. They can look very similar and they can show up in the same person at the same time, but there are technically different causes and different signs of each. So burnout is something that tends to happen. It's kind of like a special type of work-related stress, an ongoing chronic stress within the workplace. And it is often seen as a state of physical or emotional exhaustion, which also involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and just a loss of personal identity, either to work or in general. The way this might impact the people who work for you or that you work around is when somebody's burnt out, they might just become more cynical or critical about themselves or the work that they're doing or the people that they're working with. They may have a lot of trouble getting started, kind of dragging themselves to the job. They show up maybe a little bit later than they normally would. It can look like irritability, impatience, either with coworkers or the clients. They might have some low energy, difficulty concentrating. It also often shows up as not having as much satisfaction from the achievements or work tasks that they've completed. So they don't feel quite as successful. Maybe they start to feel disillusioned about the work that they're doing. Similar to vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, there may be some things that they do to numb or distance themselves from the work-related stress. So using food, drugs, alcohol, or other numbing activities to avoid thoughts or feelings about work. It may also come with changes in their sleep habits. So people who may typically sleep fairly well may start to experience a lot of sleep disturbances, insomnia, things like that. They may also start to notice unexplained physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, bowel problems, and other physical complaints that maybe they didn't have previously. So to go to the next slide, where this can impact the organization. These two conditions, vicarious trauma and burnout, they do often happen in relation to the work that we're doing. And the way that it can impact the organization is, if you're in a role of leadership, you may start to notice your folks are maybe more tardy. They're not showing up on time, or perhaps they're calling out of work more and more frequently. You may start to see some increased conflict or withdrawal between colleagues or between a worker and a supervisor. You might also see some people who are overworking themselves. So I want to emphasize this fact too, because a lot of us who are in the helping fields we feel really drawn toward helping people and very, very urgent because the need is so high. But I guess the frustrating part about that can be when you're in a state of vicarious trauma or burnout, that drive to work can increase, even when the solution may not be more work. This can also lead to potential for more errors in the work. So this is where we start talking about the potential ethical implications of somebody who is experiencing vicarious trauma or burnout and working directly with other people. They may see errors in the work one-on-one or in paperwork, other tasks related to direct care. You might see people just decreasing their participation in the workplace community itself. So somebody may have been fairly outgoing and involved in your workplace culture. You may see them start to withdraw from that. You might also see a lowered desire for collaboration. People are starting to go off and do their own thing. You might hear from your providers that they just don't feel like they're doing well at their work. And you may see a difference, right? Like you may be able to see that they're doing good work, but they're reporting to you, gosh, I really feel like I'm just not doing a good job at all. And finally, you might start to see some avoidance of obligations in general. People might just avoid doing the tasks that are assigned to them, or they may have a very low level of motivation to complete those tasks. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how and why workers burn out. And I see that there's a poll, so I'll take a moment here. I'd like to have folks fill out this poll as they see fit. The question is, have you worked in places where burnout was common? And the second question is, below is a list of factors that contribute to burnout. Are any of them present at your current organization?
And this poll is not, when we were putting this presentation together, this poll is not to say, shame on you for working at this place where burnout
No.
is happening. The point is that, like, we are all we're all in this.
Yes.
And
Yes.
nobody, like, you're not uniquely terrible or sucky as an organization
No.
for having high levels of burnout. Like, it's we're here to fix that, not shame that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so as I'm seeing answers come in, the vast majority of folks say either yes, I've worked at one or two organizations where burnout was common, or yes, burnout has been a common occurrence at every organization I've worked at. So just to normalize, this is happening in many, many places across the spectrum of provider services. And in let's see, the factors that contribute to burnout, things that people have experienced. Overwhelming caseloads, high employee turnover, unfair compensation. So it sounds like lots of folks here have experienced a lot of the contributing factors to burnout, which is just really important for us to acknowledge. And so we have those listed here on this slide. I'll just go over them quickly. I'm sure if you've worked in a place that has had these characteristics, it's not unfamiliar to you, but just to highlight some of the biggest reasons that people burn out. One, they're overworked, excessive workload, too few staff, not enough resources. Workplace dynamics can add to burnout. So if it's dysfunctional, disorganized, there's not a lot of clarity around the dynamic or the expectations, that can lead to burnout, as well as extremes in activity of the workplace dynamic itself. So is it a very monotonous workplace where there's not a lot of mental stimulation, or is it really chaotic and there's a lot of stuff going on? Or does it swing between the two, creating a sense of uncertainty? Expectations for workers can be a big part of burnout. So something we'll talk about a little bit later is the expectation of being always on, always available, even when they're not at work or scheduled to work. This can include just like a cultural expectation around working long hours, staying later into the evenings when they're not scheduled, working weekends, stuff like that. The culture, so workplace cultures of perfectionism, high achievement, and pressure to perform It's pervasive, I've seen across many industries, so we are by no means unique in this, but it does tend to come out quite frequently in our line of work where people have this really strong drive to do really, really good work, which is great until it kind of tips over that edge. And then there's that culture of perfectionism. Limited autonomy. This one's actually pretty big. When providers and staff don't feel like they have any sense of control over their work life, which includes the schedules that they hold, the assignments that they have, workload, or access to resources, this can really contribute to or worsen burnout. And of course, everybody's favorite topic, unfair compensation. Low compensation for high intensity work, it's really important that this be said. It can increase not only on the job stress, but stress outside of work. Financial stress is a huge contributor to burnout. Okay. So now we will move into part 2, which is creating compassionate policies and fostering a supportive culture. So what I want to highlight in this section are 3 different areas. Leadership, first and foremost, being trained in trauma-aware organizational practices. And we'll talk a little bit about what that can look like for your organization in a moment. The next thing that we're going to talk about are the systems and cultures that you have in place in your workplace. So this means promoting systems and cultures that allow providers to disconnect from work when they're not there, giving them space to be whole people, both within their work and outside of it, as well as safety resources. So this means investing in the types of resources that provide both physical and emotional safety for the people who work for you. Okay, so we're going to move first to the trauma-informed organizational practices, SAMHSA's 6 principles. I'm just going to go through each of these briefly and talk about what they mean when we're talking about creating trauma-informed organizational practices. So safety, first and foremost, that means physical, emotional, and psychological safety is prioritized within the workplace. Trustworthiness and transparency. This means that there's open and regular communication between leadership and staff. So there are not a lot of decisions being made behind closed doors in secret that come as a surprise to staff. They are made aware regularly of what is happening within the organization. The next one is peer support. So people with lived experience with trauma feel supported by the organization, and they also support each other. This is a really important aspect where, I think a lot of folks who are survivor providers end up needing a lot of support within the workplace as well. And having that peer support can create a sense of safety within the organization. The next one is collaboration and mutuality. So this is the principle that everybody has a role to play in a trauma-informed approach at your organization. It doesn't matter how senior they are or their level of power within the organization. This is everything from, the interns who work for you all the way up to the executive level, the folks who are making the organizational decisions. It's important that people feel like they have a say and that their voices are heard when decisions are being made. Okay, so the next one, empowerment, voice, and choice. So this one states it's important that employees and clients have opportunities to use their voice and that they feel comfortable doing so. So creating an environment where people know that they can speak up if they have concerns and they're not going to be punished for doing so. This also means encouraging employees and giving them opportunities to speak up and raise issues and challenges, especially if something is harming them or negatively impacting their ability to do their job, or if it's harming clients. It's very important that these types of things are able to be given voice at the appropriate times with leadership. And the last one is cultural, historical, and gender inclusion policies. So this is creating a set of policies within your organization, policies, protocols, and processes that are responsive to the racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of all of your employees and all of your clients. And it's making sure that you're recognizing and addressing historical trauma. So these are the 6 principles outlined by SAMHSA. These are the things that you might strive for as an organization in looking at these principles, kind of examining your policies and examining the workplace culture and saying, where do we engender a sense of safety and where do we fall short? Are there areas where we can include more peer support or areas where we can include more collaboration for the people who work for us? Okay. So the next slide, we'll go to the trauma-informed organizational practices based on the Missouri model. So this is actually a specific model that organizations can follow in order to increase their level of trauma-informed practices. And I'm just going to highlight very briefly for you and then provide some resources for further reading the different levels of the trauma-informed organizational practices. So first, we start with awareness. This is that first level where an organization becomes aware of how prevalent trauma is and the impact that it has on workers, clients, and business outcomes. So bringing this all under consideration when starting to build that awareness. Number 2 is trauma sensitivity. So this is where the organization begins to understand trauma-informed principles, causes, expressions, and possible ways to overcome the problems that affect workers and the business. Number 3 is trauma responsive practices. So this is where the organization begins to really implement changes that affect the culture, routines, and human resources processes to eliminate possible triggers for trauma within the workplace. And number 4 is trauma informed. So this is where the organization begins to implement trauma informed practices and begins to monitor the impacts of those changes made to policies and practices. So if this is a new model, it's okay if you're kind of wondering more about this and you're not quite sure, but we do want to ask, if you were to make a guess, what level of the Missouri model do you think your organization would be now? We'll wait just a few moments here for the answers to come in. Okay.
And I mean, moving from awareness to informed is not an overnight.
No.
That's not an overnight thing.
Nope. Not at all.
You can't. That's not something you solve with a pizza party. It's definitely a process. We do have a question. What if your organization isn't at any level? Like, what if they're not even aware that trauma is prevalent and is impacting your workers? What do you do with that? What advice or what suggestion might you have for this person who's thinking, oh man, we're not even part of the way there yet?
What I would say is you've just started on the journey of becoming more aware, right? So you being here and saying, oh my goodness, like my organization isn't even at the point where they understand that trauma is a thing, which I sincerely hope that is not the case, but I understand that happens a lot. To that, I'll say again, you are starting that process right now, whether you're in leadership and you're looking for things to bring back to your team to start changing the culture within your workplace, or if you are a service provider and you are looking for things to bring back to leadership and say, listen, I'd really like to start this process of our organization becoming at least aware, trauma aware. You're doing that now. And rest assured, I do have a list of some good resources for folks to start, extra reading, extra resources you can access. And there's actually a toolkit, I believe, where you can look more into the process of moving from awareness to sensitivity to responsive to informed. And yes, as Mary Beth said, it is not overnight. This is something that happens over time with concerted effort from the organization, which again, you're starting, which is fantastic. So these are the continued reading opportunities. It says for leadership, but at any level within your organization, these things can be very helpful. There will also be links to these particular resources at the end of this slideshow, so you can get those links and go directly to those resources. They are a trauma-informed approach to workforce by the National Fund for Workforce Solutions. We've got the toolkit for trauma-informed approaches by the Family Services Cabinet Council. And then if you are in a supervision role or you are being supervised, this one could be particularly helpful. It's using the secondary traumatic stress core competencies in trauma-informed supervision. And that is produced by the National Child Traumatic Stress Institute. So I'd highly recommend checking each of those out, seeing which ones would be most applicable to your organization and taking it back to the folks who can help you push for change. Okay, so next I want to talk a little bit about what leadership can do to help push these concepts forward in setting the type of tone for workers in disconnecting and disengaging from their work, which is an important aspect of protecting against vicarious trauma and burnout. So I want to, in this particular slide, I do want to more address the leadership. However, this can be applicable to everybody listening. But if you're in a place of leadership, you do have a lot of influence over setting the tone within your organization. And that can be a really powerful and positive thing. People watch leadership, right? And they look to leadership to kind of understand what they're supposed to do within their organization. So if those in leadership are overextended and participate in overwork, many of the workers and providers will feel the urge to do the same. They may feel pressured to do the same or obligated to also overwork and overextend themselves. So this is actually an invitation for leadership to take care of themselves in order to take care of their teams by setting the tone of what is a more compassionate workplace for everybody. You can do this by modeling appropriate boundaries and engaging in the types of behaviors that you'd ultimately like to see in your providers. So here are just some suggestions. Take what works for you, leave the rest. If you want to continue expanding on this, I totally invite it. I would recommend not responding after hours unless you are on call or it's a crisis. I know there's a lot of urgency around like, I got an email at 10:30, I need to respond. Take a beat, really try to determine whether this is something that needs a response now or if it can wait for the next business day. Leadership, I would encourage you as much as is possible, avoid working late, long hours or working hours that you're not scheduled. I have a lot of people that I work with who say specifically, well, my boss works very late. My boss stays after hours. I feel like I need to do that too. So again, setting the tone, what are you communicating to folks on your team when you are also overworking and basically not allowing yourself to honor the time boundaries that you have with your work? I'd also encourage you, although it may feel uncomfortable, not possible, but just consider it for a moment, turning down extra responsibilities or delegating tasks when you are overextended. I think a lot of us have this drive, again, this urge to take on as much as we can to help as many people as possible. But I'm going to use that age-old phrase, you cannot pour from an empty cup. And so taking on extra responsibilities when you are overextended maybe isn't the best thing to do for everybody, right? Again, it comes down to modeling. So what can you do instead? I would encourage you to think about doing some of these things and adding your own list. Demonstrating openness and flexibility when workers make reasonable requests to leave work or set time boundaries. This looks like honoring time off requests, encouraging people to take time off if that's what they need to do, making it a company culture of when you need the time, you're able to take the time. Going back to, setting the tone and modeling, you honoring your own needs to attend personal appointments, like going to a doctor, like going to your own therapy appointments. It could be childcare that you need to tend to. Modeling that for workers, that it's okay to do those things. And last, I would encourage you to engage with your own interests outside of work and encourage your providers to do the same. So if you have a hobby that is not at all related to the work that you do that and really, really make it known. You don't have to involve people in it with you, but like show people that it is not only acceptable, but encouraged to have interests and activities outside of work.
We are getting a lot of chatter
Yeah.
in the chat about the after hours emails. Lots of folks are suggesting everybody should be putting emails on a delay send, because not everybody's productive hours are the same as everybody else's. We do, like, I know Brennison, who you all know and love, is often sending emails late at night, or at least used to. And it I know that getting those emails late at night can put some pressure on you to respond to those emails late at night. So that delay send is a really good tip, but also maybe putting in your email signature. Like, I might be sending this email at a time that doesn't make sense for you to respond to. Don't feel like you have to respond right away. Giving people that permission out front.
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever fits within your company culture to communicate that message, whether it is having time delay. So I use, Gmail frequently. They have the schedule send. I'm sure most email clients do now. Where I've been in my own office. I'm not innocent in this. Like, I've been in my own office at 10 o'clock at night. And like, I'm going to send this. Wait, okay, let me hit send tomorrow at 8 a.m. Just that little bit of extra thought that you can put into it and saying, this is not urgent right now. And I don't want this person to see this and think that they have to respond right now. Similar to the signature, right? Like maybe writing in there, my work hours may not be your work hours. Feel free to respond when it works for you. Can go a long way for people who have that immediate sense of urgency around responding to anything that comes to them at any time. So again, this is just like, it's a really fun and exciting opportunity that you as leadership have to set the type of tone that will be good for the workers that work with you, but also maybe for yourself, where you get to have those boundaries too, and you get to disconnect from your work. Okay, and I say that there are some questions, so I think somebody said they would be keeping track of that. Just want to make sure we're keeping track of those things. Okay, so the next slide, allowing workers to disconnect and disengage. We want to invest in workers' lives outside of work. And this is obviously going to be unique based on the resources that your organization has accessible. Some organizations have more financial resources, others don't have quite as much, but there are other ways that they can invest in their providers outside of the workplace. So some areas to consider. Do your providers have educational goals, and how can you help them attain them? So this may look like assistance with tuition, student loans, or CEU reimbursement. Wellness goals. So you might invest in wellness programs or health insurance benefits that will allow workers to take care of themselves on the job and outside of work as well. One thing that I've seen a lot of organizations do, which I think is pretty cool, and I think it could be an interesting way to encourage people to remain engaged with the community, is volunteer goals. So perhaps your organization would consider an additional paid day off or two for providers to go and participate in volunteer activities of their choice within the community. Other areas where you may consider allowing workers to disconnect is investing in the spiritual, religious, and cultural goals. So honoring holidays that are celebrated by staff and allowing them to have those days off. Okay, next, in allowing workers to disconnect and disengage. And with this one, I'm going to just, I'm going to encourage you just to notice the reactions that you have to my suggestions, because some of them, they may feel a little bit like, oh, well, that'd be nice, but that's okay. I just want you to take it in and notice how you feel about these suggestions. So building PTO into your policies and your culture, consider a mandatory PTO policy. That is, for example, workers are given a certain number of PTO days, and they have to use them in order to continue accruing hours past a certain point. So one of the first places that I worked as a therapist, they had this type of policy where I don't even remember how many hours it was, but they gave us a certain number of hours up front. And once you had reached that level, therapists were basically, they needed to take time off. They encouraged us to take a long weekend or to take, a vacation week. And after that point, once we'd taken the PTO, we could then continue accruing. So this is a way to basically encode within your policies, we find PTO really important. We want you to take it. So when people go on PTO and they're out of the office, respect it. Respect it. So don't reach out to them while they're on PTO. Set those delayed sends. You can schedule emails. If they're not scheduled to work on a weekend, respect that, right? Like as much as you're able to within your organization, when people are not scheduled to be at work, respect that. And as much as you can, don't reach out to them. And then third, ease their mind. I worked in several places where, finding coverage can be, it's tricky, right? And we all know that it can be tricky to find people to cover groups or services if somebody's taking time off. I would encourage leadership to work with providers to find a proactive way of creating contingency plans for when staff are out. So again, that's that collaboration and the mutual effort. Work with everybody to find ways to get coverage when people are out of the office.
Yeah, because sometimes people don't take time off because they're afraid who's gonna fill in if I'm not there.
Yeah.
We have a question in the Q&A that is pretty kind of related to respecting PTO, not reaching out to people who are on PTO. This person says, I have staff who check their emails and Teams messages when they're off. I've advised them against it. They say they feel better and are able to relax more when they're aware of what's going on at work. What are your thoughts on this? As the supervisor, I check in sporadically and as needed. I know they think they're being efficient and I don't want to pop that bubble, but I also know what being connected all the time can do. Any advice?
Yeah, so this is one of those areas where it's balancing cultural needs with individual needs. So there may be some folks who feel pressured to check in because of workplace culture, and when they're given that opportunity to not, they'll happily take it. And for some people, they truly honestly feel better when they can check in and when they do know what's going on. So taking it on an individual basis, I would encourage you to explore that with them as far as you're comfortable. So what is it for you about being away from work and not knowing what's going on that creates such anxiety? So what could possibly be happening where checking in and interrupting your time away from work feels better than disconnecting? You may find some answers that you're not expecting, and it's going to be very individual to the person who's having that experience of anxiety. You may find that there are some processes and procedures within your workplace that are contributing to that sense of needing to know what's going on. And then from that point, you can work with that person to see, is there a way that we can work with this process or this procedure to ease your mind? There might not be. anything that you can do. And at that point, it's acknowledging that each worker ultimately has a say in how they conduct their work. And if they, for themselves, have determined that checking in regularly eases their mind, and there aren't really other things to do to alleviate that, then respecting that. Because when it comes down to it, we all have different ways that we want to interact with work, and we're all going to have different ways of it feeling comfortable. And so once you've set that workplace culture of checking out if you want to and providing that as an option, allowing people to take that as they will. It is tricky, though, I will admit, because if you don't want people checking in when they're not at work, it can feel like, oh, like I see that this may not be the best, but it's that self-determination, right? And autonomy. If they truly have decided that they need to check in, they're probably going to do it anyways. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah, I think that would be the way that I might approach it if I had somebody with similar concerns.
Thanks, Megan.
Yeah.
We do have that person saying, yeah, absolutely, it's a balance between autonomy and making sure you're protecting them. But somebody else is saying just as important as looking at how people return to work after a long time away, because sometimes we do need a day or two before we're like back up to level again.
Yeah.
I know I used to think when I would come back from time off, I would think, oh God, I have no idea what I'm walking into. I need to know what I'm walking into. So there was a period of time where whenever I would take time off, I would like doom scroll the shelter log of like what had happened each day while I was gone. And I was looking at that while I was gone. I couldn't do anything about it. There was nothing I could do. It wasn't helping me, but I felt like I was somehow preparing myself to walk back into work. But really what I was doing was just increasing my dread.
Yes.
So I stopped doing that.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And I want to point out as well something that Courtney just wrote. Great point. No one likes feeling like they're returning to so much work that it wasn't worth taking the time away. I want to validate that very real experience for a lot of people. They'll take time away and just come back to so much that like, this was not even worth it for me. Again, I'm speaking from the lens of this being a long-term effort within the organization to change that type of culture. If you're in leadership, I would encourage you to consider, how can we lessen that experience for people? How can we lessen that experience of there always being so much work to do that it doesn't even make sense to take time off because it's going to be more stressful when we get back. And I get it. Like, resources are slim, especially now. We have to be mindful about how we set up our policies. But if you're looking long term, just considering how you might be able to reduce some of that impact. Okay. On to resources for safety. So this is also really important, especially in the realm of vicarious traumatization and compassion fatigue. We want to make sure that people have a workplace that feels safe for them, especially in the field of direct service. We encounter a lot of stories that can create some hypervigilance with us. And in some cases, we need to make sure that the workers and the providers are in environments that are safe to them. So this could be either within the physical building where services are provided, or if you have people who are going out into the community, providing services to folks in their homes, and other areas of the community, just making sure that you have a lot of support for those people in either space. So for emergencies, one thing that I learned early on in working in mental health, especially working one-on-one, just having some way for the provider within the one-to-one space to contact somebody outside of the room if they need support. This doesn't always mean that the person that they're supporting is a safety risk to them. There could be something happening in the session where the client is experiencing a crisis themselves. So we want to make sure that people are prepared either way to reach for help when they cannot leave the room. So this could include emergency phones and buttons in spaces where workers meet with survivors. Training. So training your staff at all levels in de-escalation, crisis prevention, and nonviolent communication. There are specific organizations that do this specific training for organizations at all levels. I would highly recommend investing in those trainings to make sure that all staff feel prepared if there is a crisis or an emergency situation. The next would be support for the people who are doing the work. So that could include backup or support for people who are meeting with others in the community, backup or support for people who are meeting one-on-one in closed rooms. Again, going back to phones in the rooms or buttons in the rooms, just having that layer of support can be really important. It can also look like sending two providers out together if they're out in the community. So sending kind of like the buddy system, that could be helpful, increasing the sense of safety and support as they're doing their work. And then after that, providing opportunities for debriefing. And this isn't only for crisis situations. This can be even a daily or weekly opportunity for direct support providers to debrief, especially if they've been hearing a lot of traumatic content or really difficult content. Just making sure they have that space to talk about it can do a lot for people in increasing their sense of safety on the job. Let me see, just checking the questions.
We have some requests for training suggestions, for de-escalation training suggestions, if you have any.
I went through a training with, I believe it's called CPI, the Crisis Prevention Institute. That was an in-person training, and it was actually a couple of days long, in providing training on, managing physical confrontation, crisis de-escalation, stuff like that. I believe it's called CPI. I would encourage you to look into that organization. Also, just the book Nonviolent Communication. I think having especially folks in leadership reading that book and applying those principles could be very helpful. I have CPI. Yes. So Brooke says CPI is awesome. It's a great training. Verbal de-escalation strategies are great. If you don't have to use physical de-escalation, wonderful, wonderful. The verbal de-escalation is fantastic. So yes, thanks for adding that, Brooke. Appreciate it.
Somebody also is mentioning, and in the meantime, if your org is already doing some stuff to promote employee health or wellness and time away, please put that in the chat, give everybody else some good ideas. But there is a mention in the chat of including personal safety planning for workers. So there is some understanding of, if you're exposed to a situation or a client whose story is really triggering your own stuff, how do you manage your own, like what are the tools that you have at your disposal to manage your own triggering, and then who, maybe that plan includes who to call in with this person instead. I thought safety planning for staff is very important. I live to safety plan with survivors, and then I realize sometimes, oh, I too need a safety plan.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that. And it will be, specific to the environment where you're working. So if you are out in the community, what types of things do you need to bring with you? First aid kits, any other safety tools that you can bring, plans that you can make. I live near a train track, so I apologize if you can hear that in the background. But yes, I would absolutely advocate for safety planning with staff. I think that's super important. Okay, so now we are on to promoting sustainable self-care for your workers. So for the people who are working for you, support staff, all that good stuff, we're going to go over ways to support them in that. Okay, so just some suggestions. Again, take what works for you, leave the rest, build this out as you need to. This will kind of go back over what we've already talked about, but I think repetition can really help when we're talking about these things. So again, providing frequent opportunities for debriefing and grounding. This is especially important for those who are, direct witnesses to the stories of trauma, or who are listening to stories of trauma frequently. This is also really important if there is a crisis within your organization. Debriefing can go a long way in helping people feel supported and safe. Next, really listening to and incorporating feedback from survivor providers regarding safety policies, job responsibilities, and more. This goes back to the empowerment and the collaboration and mutuality. Again, we really want to make sure that people at all levels of the organization, at the very least, have a forum where they can voice their concerns and make their requests. And giving them, the not just the sense, but the reassurance that they are being listened to. Even if all of their feedback is not incorporated, it's important that they know that they're being heard. After that, creating frequent opportunities for providers to receive supervision, support, or even temporary relief from their duties. So I love the supervision process. I love group supervision, individual supervision. Even if you're not in a clinical supervision relationship, leadership can do a lot to create a safe space for providers to talk about what's going on for them within their work. So I'd really highly encourage folks to create that space where they can receive that at a cadence that works for them. In the therapy world, a lot of the time, especially when you are newer to the field, you get once a week supervision. For a lot of places, it's once a week individual plus group supervision. It may look different for your organization, but again, highly recommended. Next is investing in those resources and policies that promote radical self-care for providers. So again, that's the allowing them to disengage from work, having that within your policies, whether that is through your PTO policy or the coverage policies, allowing providers to engage in that radical self-care, knowing that the things at work that need to be taken care of are going to be taken care of when they're not there. My favorite one, bottom left, provide compensation that is commensurate with the work provided and the expectations of providers. I do always have to say this, knowing that resources are slim, I understand that. I will still advocate for this regardless. Financial stress and financial insecurity are some of the biggest contributors to burnout. So as much as your organization is able to compensate fairly, I will always encourage that. It doesn't always come in the form of salary or hourly wages. It also looks like the benefits that you provide, including tuition reimbursement, paying for CEUs, health insurance, things like that. Okay, next, promoting an environment of social support and collaboration among colleagues. This is both a top-down and lateral type of process. We don't have a lot of time to get into that today, but this goes back to, leadership setting the tone of support and collaboration and finding ways to encourage that among providers, and also promoting the idea that within certain limits, providers and workers can have a process of settling conflict or working through disagreements with each other. It's really important that workers can feel like there's a process between them as well as through leadership to, settle any conflicts that may come up, to establish a sense of collaboration, and that people feel autonomous in that they can say, I don't always have to go to HR first. I feel free to speak with my colleague, and I know that I will have other processes available to me if that doesn't work. Next would be using buddy systems. So we talked about that in the realm of safety. But this can be especially important for those who are less experienced, who are newer to the field. Just having somebody next to them who can provide support, feedback, reassurance, and safety can be super helpful. And really at any stage of your career, it's nice to have a buddy sometimes. So if you're able to make that work for your folks, I would strongly encourage that. And the last are those peer support opportunities for debriefing and just generally getting support from people who understand what it is like to work in this field, especially for those who have a history of trauma themselves. Yeah, would highly recommend having a peer support system at your organization if you're able to do so. Okay, so this is one way that you in leadership can help your providers set healthy boundaries. Again, disclaimer, this may not apply to you. There may be pieces that apply, but not all. Again, take what works, leave the rest. So when you're in leadership, especially if you have direct services that your providers provide, you can talk about referrals with them. So sitting down with providers and talking with them about the types of cases that should be referred to other providers due to any specific content or excessive levels of traumatic detail. So this is where you can be mindful and sensitive to the trauma histories of the people who work with you if they have disclosed that, and talking with them about the types of cases that they're comfortable with and the types of cases that may trigger, their traumatic responses. Next, I would say is honoring their availability. So again, talking with providers about their time and emotional availability, and as best as you're able to, honoring those limits. So in a lot of different agencies and folks I've worked with who work within agencies, there's again that sense of always needing to take on a new case, always needing to schedule a new client, X, Y, and Z, with that intent of helping the largest number of people possible. But I've also heard a lot of folks say, like, I don't have space emotionally, and my schedule is actually not even that open either, but I'm taking on a new client anyways. It's like, I'd really like to encourage you in leadership to bridge that communication gap, work with providers one-on-one, look at their schedule with them, talk about the type of emotional availability that they have, and find a solution that works for both of you. You can help your providers say no, which I know there's a lot of talk around saying no in general. It's a very important thing to be able to do. But one of the ways that you can support them in setting that boundary is by demonstrating it. So this goes back to what we were saying before, setting the tone. Demonstrate to your workers that it's okay to say no to those extra tasks and extra responsibilities that cannot be reasonably accomplished by a single provider. So if you are overextended and you are saying yes, more often than not, folks will feel pressured to do the same. So try to set that tone of, hey, you're overextended. You can say no, you can delegate. We can find a different solution for this as much as is possible. We'll go down to mindful scheduling. So please, for yourself and for the people who work for you, try not to schedule over designated break times. Please try not to schedule over your own lunch or the lunches of people who work for you. It's vitally important that we have those breaks during the day. It's vitally important that people have those small opportunities throughout the day to disconnect. So as much as possible, honor those break times, honor the non-working hours, and don't schedule during them. Which leads us to the next one, non-scheduled hours. Again, setting the tone, encourage your providers as much as possible to not take calls, texts, or emails during non-scheduled hours. This will look different for every organization. Lots of orgs have on-call folks, and so it's not really possible for them to not take calls overnight. If that's the case, I would highly encourage, I'm forgetting the word, but a schedule where you have a an on-call schedule that switches between workers. So no one worker is on call all of the time, at least giving them a week off, if not longer, as much as is possible within your organization. And when they are not on call and they're not responsible for that, strongly encouraging them to turn off the phone, set the away message on their email, schedule send, whatever it needs to be. And then last, helping your providers build breaks into their day. So this means promoting regularly scheduled times throughout the workday where they can engage with grounding exercises, movement, self-care, eating food, getting water, going outside for 5 minutes, whatever it needs to look like. Encourage that for folks. There's a lot of research that shows these small breaks throughout the day actually make us more productive overall, rather than trying to power through the day without taking time. So highly encourage that as well. Okay. So again, we have another poll. When it comes to time off, please respond as you see fit. And then the second question, check which statements describe the culture of time off at your organization. So we'll give people just a few moments here to answer these questions.
Just to beat y'all over the head with the idea that your approach as leadership to time off is going to color everybody else's approach to time off.
Yeah. And that is to emphasize the fact that it's my belief that everybody deserves the time off, whether you're leadership or provider level or staff level. It is overall better for folks to be able to take the time off and have that honored in a way that works for them. Okay, so looking at poll answers. Oh, when it comes to time off, the majority of folks, 50%. See, checking work email once a day when I'm on PTO, just in case. Yep. I'm loving how there's at least some folks who take PTO frequently and totally disconnect when they do. Fantastic. For others, I appreciate the honesty. I think we're all at different levels of engaging with our work when we're on PTO, and just want to normalize that. A lot of us feel that pull to check in even when we're off. Can't remember the last time I took PTO. I need to be available in case my staff needs to use theirs. That's 7% of respondents. Okay. And the answers are somewhat variable between the culture of time off within organizations. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for answering that. It's always interesting to see how different experiences can be across organizations. Okay. So this slide, it's just another reiteration. Repetition is great. I love it. We want to encourage boundaries in the workplace. So this means encouraging your providers to care for themselves emotionally, physically, and I'll say mentally as well. Encourage providers to engage with their outside interests. So let people know that it is not only okay, but encouraged to have hobbies that have nothing to do with work. And also encouraging time off, which is vacation, mental health days, time for regular appointments, etc. And then helping to set boundaries within the workplace. This can look like helping providers determine what is realistic to accomplish versus that wishful thinking. So how much can you actually take on versus how much do you wish you could take on? Helping providers learn how to avoid being overly responsible for their survivors' well-being. We want to be responsive, we want to help and promote wellness for the people that we work for. But when we become over-responsible, that's where things tend to go a little haywire. And then actively helping providers balance their caseload. So if at all possible, providing them with a mix of more and less traumatized clients, survivors and non-survivors, If that's something that is available to you within your organization, would highly recommend it. It can be a welcome change of pace in the day to go from a trauma session to an art play therapy session. Just having that variability can do a lot to help workers. Okay, so this one, I like this slide a lot. And so if you're here in a leadership role, just take note if you're bristling at any of these particular statements. These are the boundaries that your providers may say to you. And so I just, again, want to encourage you to notice how you react to them, notice how it feels to hear them, and just kind of keep in mind that other people setting boundaries with us can feel uncomfortable, but they're also an invitation for a continued professional relationship. So as much as you're able to, try to encourage and praise employees who are able to state their boundaries and do what you can to respect them. I'll just read a couple of them. And if you're brave, I would say print this slide off and give it to your providers. If you want to encourage this workplace culture, give them some opportunities to see what a boundary could sound like. One might be, my time off is not negotiable. I'm happy to talk about helping to find coverage while I'm away. Another might be, I am not available to talk about that subject, or I'm not available to complete that task. Another might be, I'm unable to work during my unpaid lunch hour. I'm no longer accepting phone calls, text messages, or emails when I'm not scheduled to work or when I'm not scheduled to be on call. And these are pretty direct. And so obviously folks are going to want to rephrase these in a way that feels honest to themselves. But I would encourage you to take a look at this list, see which ones you really like, see if there are any that really, you're just like, oh, that feels weird to read that. I'm not sure how I feel about that. And just kind of sit with that for a little bit. And again, if you're feeling brave, print it off and give it to your providers. Okay. Another thing that I would like all of you to know is that survivor providers' experiences may show up in their work. In fact, it is more likely than not, if somebody is a survivor and in a provider role, the degree to which that shows up is obviously going to be different person by person, but it may show up. So for survivor providers, it may show up in the following ways. They may feel like they have a better sense of being able to understand what survivors are experiencing. That can be positive or negative. Negative's maybe not quite the word. It can present some challenges, I'll say. They may not feel like they have the space to engage in their own healing due to over attending to the needs of others. So this is that part where we may start to feel more responsible for the survivors that we're working with. And this can show up in our work as becoming overly involved, fuzzy boundaries, stuff like that. Feeling the need to be strong and responsible all of the time, limiting the emotions that they're allowed to experience. So with this, I'd like to ask all of you to consider, do you have people in your organization who are always saying yes all of the time, who are always reliable? They're the ones who always show up, always ready to do it, and seem to have trouble saying no. The implication is not that those people are definitely, survivors or definitely like overworked, but it's something to keep an eye on. It's that idea that the folks who appear the strongest on the outside may be struggling more than we know. And for folks who are always saying yes, always reliable, always on, answering emails at 10:30 at night, responding at 6 in the morning, they might be some of the lesser boundaried people within your organizations. And it would be worthwhile checking in with them about whether or not they need support in setting healthier boundaries for themselves. And just in general, someone to check in with. This isn't an area to push them or to make them believe that they don't have good boundaries. But for some people, even being given that space to talk about it and feeling like it is a safe space to say, I really struggle to say no. I feel like I can't turn it off. Just allowing that opportunity to talk can be really powerful. Okay, so some other ways that survivor providers' experiences may show up in their work is they may have a strong drive to neglect their own needs in order to be accessible for others. So this is why I overemphasize, please don't schedule during lunch and other scheduled breaks. A lot of us, myself included, we tend to schedule over lunch breaks, or we tend to schedule in the evenings or other times when we're not actually available. And it can be easy at times to neglect our own needs, like eating food, like drinking water, like going to the bathroom in order to be accessible. And one more way that it may show up in survivor providers' work is they rarely or never ask for help due to survival instincts, like needing to be independent and do everything on their own. So I want to emphasize the word may. So it may show up this way. It does not mean somebody is a survivor provider. This is not an invitation to pressure them to reveal that to you. However, it's important to be mindful of these things as you're working with other people. And to that point, if you're in an organization where you employ survivor providers, and you are hoping to provide a safe, transparent, optional space for them to share, I just have a few considerations for you. Somebody may wish to encourage that in order to improve cohesion and reduce isolation. And we just want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that is trauma sensitive and trauma aware. So if you are in a position of providing a space for survivor providers to share their story, first I would ask you, what's the intention? So why do you want people to share? What is it that you are hoping to achieve within your organization by providing that space for them to share if they wish? Second would be that level of trust. So going back again to Sam's principles, do you have a workplace based on the principle of trust, where those who want to share can trust that their story is safe with their colleagues and supervisors? If you're getting the sense that that may not be the case, there's no judgment. I would just like to encourage you to consider ways that you can increase the sense of safety so that those who wish to share can. We'll go down to the goal. So what type of result or response are you hoping for in encouraging people to share? What are your expectations, and are you prepared to have something else happen if survivor providers do share their stories? And what types of supports do you have available to them if things don't go according to plan? And then detail. So how much information is appropriate for your organization? Where do you want your providers to be able to share this? Is it in an individual supervision space? Is it within a group supervision? Just being mindful of the environment that you're allowing people to share in. And if at all possible, going back to that collaboration and mutuality, asking people, where would you feel safest sharing this information if you were to do so? And then finally, how do you intend to care for those who are hearing the stories of their colleagues? And additionally, how do you intend to care for those who are telling their stories? This adds to that level of trust that you can build within the organization. What do you want to be able to do to make sure that this information is safe and appropriate for the setting? And I believe we have a question for the chat. What actions, based on what you know about your organization right now, what actions can you take to make your organization a better steward of survivor provider stories? It's okay if you don't have a fully formed idea yet, but even if you want to share some starting ideas of what you might be able to do, would love to hear some of those in the chat. So we have some folks adding
There's
stuff.
there's a great story in the chat that kind of reminds us that when big, huge, awful community events happen, they are not just happening to the people that we serve. They are happening to us too. Providers are also a part of the community. And so when the community experiences a natural disaster or a huge tragedy, your providers are going to be affected by that just as much as the people that you are supposed to serve. And so
Yes.
you've got to fix that. They've got to get their own stuff together really
Mm-hmm.
before being able to do anything helpful for anybody else in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm recalling when COVID first started. I loved the organization I worked for, and the response to questions about, are we going to remain in person? Are we going to keep going into people's homes? Are we going to virtual? Um, I can see it now as a response trying to reassure folks on the team. But the response was business as usual, just keep doing business as usual, which was not reassuring at the time. And I can see that now as my leadership was trying to do the best that they could. They were also being impacted by the very beginnings of COVID, just as I was, just as my clients were. It's okay to take time to get grounded within yourself as leadership, because if your community is impacted by a tragedy and you're part of that community as leadership, it's impacting you too, to some degree. Even if it's not personal, you may see the ripple effect through your organization and through the people that your organization serves. So this is really humanizing that approach of, you don't always just have to be business as usual. You can take a pause. You can create spaces for people to talk about what's happening around them, to create that sense of trust and openness and respect for the things that your organization and your community are going through. Okay. So for this last slide, just to wrap things up and really give sort of like a high level overview of building compassionate workplaces and what that can look like. So engagement. We want to engage other members of leadership and workers in co-creating a culture of compassion and care for one another. So I know when people answer the question at the beginning of this webinar, we've got folks at all different levels of employment, leadership, all the way down to, staff provider level. This is that collaboration, that mutuality. We'd like to have you co-create this culture, bring this back to your team and engage them on the ways that you can create a compassionate workplace. Investment. So encouraging you to invest in the resources, trainings, all those types of things, benefits that are going to enhance providers' work experiences and improve the experiences for those that your organization serves. So investing, it can go a long way. The return on investment that I've seen for organizations who really pour into their workers and really provide them with high quality trainings, high quality benefits, it can be a fantastic thing to see. And again, disclaimer, I know that a lot of organizations are strapped for cash at this point in time. Financials are tough. I just want you to keep this in mind and work within the boundaries that your organization has. So inviting will be next. We'd like to invite feedback and create non-obstructive processes for providers to voice their concerns, provide feedback, and suggest changes to the organization. And what I mean by non-obstructive is, don't make it hard for them. Don't make them jump through a bunch of hoops to get their concerns heard. I know we all have our own required paperwork and processes, but I'd like to encourage you to find ways to reduce those barriers as much as is possible so that people feel able to communicate what's going on. And again, just being open to iterations, changes, new ideas, and challenges. None of this stuff is static. Your organization is allowed to change. I would encourage mindful, intentional change, bringing in that collaboration, bringing in multiple voices, but be open to the change. It can feel scary sometimes when culture starts to shift and we're trying new things. But I'm guessing that you're here because at least part of you wants that. Part of you wants to see a positive change within your organization. Just be open to it, and work together with your team to make the best decisions possible for your organization. Okay, so the last chat question before we move into resources. What is one takeaway from this webinar, from this discussion, that you want to bring back to your organization's leadership team? This is for everybody, regardless of the position that you hold within your organization. What do you want to bring back with you? And yeah, basically that. What would you hope to bring? I'll leave that in the chat. Importance of self-care. Yes, absolutely. Want to formalize a supervision structure for non-clinical staff. Fantastic. We need to be mindful of our own sanity and that self-care is truly essential. Yes, totally agree. Asking for feedback. Fantastic. Yep. More awareness for the value of investing in staff and creating safe spaces for debriefing and discussing concerns. Love that. Developing better channels for staff comments and concerns. Adding to the vision of establishing a safety committee. Oh, that's awesome. I love that. Safety committee. Beautiful. Buddy systems. Yep. Okay. So I'll let folks continue to add their thoughts to the chat. I'm seeing a lot of really good stuff in there. So keep an eye on that, everybody, and take a look at what your fellow attendees are saying. Now for resources, these are the links to those continued reading resources that I mentioned earlier. I believe the links will be clickable when you get the PDF, hopefully, but I've included the URL anyways. So the toolkit for trauma-informed approaches, definitely recommend that. Trauma-informed approach to the workforce, and then using the secondary traumatic stress core competencies in trauma-informed supervision. Absolutely recommend each of these. They provide a lot of really good resources. I'm laughing at myself because I see the 3 and the 4 first. It's fine. We can make mistakes. And then I would also invite all of you to, connect with me on Instagram. If you're on Instagram, I love hearing from people. I love providing resources and consultation. You can find me again at the Anti-Work Therapist on Instagram. And you can listen to me on the Mental Status podcast. That podcast is specifically about burnout within the mental health field. It's been fantastic. I feel like I've run out of breath because I have so much to say about this, but I love this topic a lot. So thank you, everybody, for joining. It was really fantastic to give this presentation today.